Good afternoon. The Senate Finance Committee is in session. I'm Dolores Kelly, the current chair, soon to be retired. And our Vice Chair, Brian Feldman, is going to be chairing today this hearing, which is very important. This Inflation Reduction Act is very important, and while not all of the aspects of it will become applicable right away, we need to know what the future will hold because the country's in such an unsettled state right now. Our Vice Chair, Brian Feldman, is going to actually chair our hearing for us today. He has been co-chair of the benefit exchange entity that we have, and he's an expert on the energy issues that are impacting on inflation. And we're going to behave ourselves and press your button if you need to talk. Okay, Senator Feldman.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So, yeah, we've got, obviously this committee has broad jurisdiction over a lot of subjects, but three of which are clean energy, health insurance, and the prescription drug issue. So I thought it was important to get a briefing on the Inflation Reduction Act because it covers all three of those subject areas. And it does have budget implications. So Chair Gazzone, Senator Griffith, and Senator McCray were all invited to join us today. I think Chair Gazzone may still join us. We've got Senator Griffith here, and I think Senator McCray may be watching from Baltimore City somewhere. So, and we've got Ben Brooks here, who may be part of this chamber, after November 8th as well. So welcome, Ben. Okay, we're going to get started on the energy policy topic. We've got Ben Hush from the National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL. So Ben, why don't you come up here, and you have a PowerPoint. In fact, we've got three presenters here, three folks specific to energy policy. So I think it'd be best to be efficient here. We're going to have Molly Knoll from the Public Service Commission also come up here, Molly. And then finally from the Maryland Energy Administration, we've got Mary Beth Tung and Landon Farrig. So why don't we just fill up the four seats on energy policy. We'll let everybody do their thing, and then we'll load up to Q&A. And then following this energy panel, we'll hear from the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange, the implications of the Inflation Reduction Act on health insurance, and then finally Andy York. I think I saw Andy here. He's Executive Director of our first in the nation Maryland Prescription Drug Affordability Board, and what the implications are for drug affordability, prescription drugs, another topic this committee is very familiar with. So, Ben, we're going to start with you from NCSL, and I know you've got a PowerPoint in front of us. So why don't you, you're going to go first, and then we'll just go down and. Yeah, these mics are movable, so you can shift around, Ben, when you're done. But we'll go through everybody, and then we'll take Q&A. Okay? So Ben, why don't you lead off on behalf of NCSL?
Great, thank you so much. Would you like me to hold my comments on the healthcare provisions? Because I was planning to do both, and
why don't you just give us the whole to do? You don't have to hold back anything.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair Kelly, Vice Chair Feldman. Good afternoon. My name is Ben Hush, Federal Affairs Advisor for the National Conference of State Legislatures, where I cover natural resources and infrastructure issues. Thank you for the opportunity to join you all today to provide an overview of the Inflation Reduction Act. Really quick, before I dive into the Inflation Reduction Act, I wanted to remind all members of the committee that NCSL is your organization serving legislators and staff for more than 40 years. We, of course, promote policy innovation, create opportunities for lawmakers to share knowledge, and ensure that state legislatures have a strong, cohesive voice in the federal system. We do this because we believe in the importance of the legislative institution and know that when states are strong, our nation is strong. Overall, NCSL tracks more than 1,400 issue areas, including, of course, today's topic, the Inflation Reduction Act. So the bill's title might lead one to believe that this bill is all about fighting inflation, which it does, of course, by spending $300 billion less than the revenue provisions are estimated to bring in. But there are also significantly more policy impacts. So let's start with a quick overview of the major components of this bill. These provisions fall into three fairly distinct buckets. First off, lowering the cost of health care for millions of Americans by both extending federal tax credits for health insurance plans purchased on federal and state insurance exchanges and limiting the cost of prescription drugs by empowering Medicare to negotiate prices on high-cost medicines and caps out-of-pocket costs from Medicare beneficiaries. Second, a recalibration of American energy industrial policy through federal investments, both tax credits and spending, in increasing domestic clean energy production and manufacturing programs as well. Third, changes to corporate tax law that increase minimum tax rates and impose new taxes on corporate buybacks, as well as significant increases in funding for the IRS to reduce the tax gaps. These tax changes account for most of the inflation savings. Now, before I dive into the healthcare and energy provisions, I think it's important to note, to differentiate how the IRA, or the Inflation Reduction Act, differs from two other major pieces of legislation passed by the 117th Congress, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, commonly called the IIJA, and the American Rescue Plan, or the ARPA. While all three are extremely large from a fiscal standpoint, they all go about spending in significantly different ways. To start, the ARP, passed in February of 2021, provided hundreds of billions of dollars to state and local governments through the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. These funds were available to states and local governments to spend how they saw fit to best respond to the impacts of the pandemic, with some constraints imposed by Congress. The IIJA, on the other hand, provided hundreds of billions of dollars to states and local governments for multiple types of infrastructure, including transportation, water, broadband, energy, and more. But these funds were provided through various existing and some new programs with much more specific and required uses. Finally, as I'm about to discuss, the IRA is significantly weighted not towards direct spending, but rather tax credits to incentivize certain behaviors and investments. And finally, of course, all three have much different time horizons, with the ARP being a spend now to counteract the impacts of the pandemic. The IIJA is a spend over 5 to 10 years to upgrade the country's infrastructure for the next half century. And finally, the IRA is a much longer-term bill that is attempting to make significant changes to American energy policy that will last generations. Okay, let's dive into the healthcare provisions. As I'm sure you might have noticed, my title did not include the word health or healthcare. Thankfully, my colleague Lauren Kalins, who is now Legislative Director for Health and Human Services at NCSL, helped prepare these slides, but sends her regrets and regards that she is unable to be here today. I know the Prescription Drug Affordability Board and the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange are also here to discuss the state implications of the IRA, so this presentation will focus primarily on the federal provisions. Overall, the IRA enacts sweeping changes to Medicare drug pricing, as well as extending the enhanced health insurance marketplace subsidies that were scheduled to expire at the end of this year. A few key takeaways about the law before we get into some of the details. The IRA does not provide direct health care funding to states. However, the law is expected to lower the health care costs for millions of Americans. And though not a direct funding stream, the IRA does present states with unique opportunities to leverage the federal law's provisions in state markets. More on that to come. So the major healthcare provisions of the IRA require the Secretary of Health and Human Services to negotiate prices for certain drugs covered by Medicare, drug companies to pay inflationary rebates if prices rise faster than inflation for drugs used by Medicare beneficiaries. It caps out-of-pocket spending on Medicare Part D retail prescription drugs at $2,000 annually, as well as limits on out-of-pocket insulin costs for Medicare beneficiaries at $35 a month. And it also extends for 3 years the Enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies for health insurance that Congress passed last year as part of the American Rescue Plan. Additionally, though not included on this slide, the Inflation Reduction Act also expands Medicare's low-income subsidy program that helps over 13 million low-income beneficiaries with out-of-pocket expenses for Part D prescription drugs. The law also expands this program by doing away with partial low-income eligibility for beneficiaries with incomes between 135% and 150% of poverty, and instead provides full benefits to these beneficiaries beginning in 2024. Both the drug price negotiations provisions and the rebate requirements of the IRA have a number of implementation complexities that are beyond the scope of today's presentation. But the key point to know about the drug price provisions is that for the first time, Medicare will have the authority to negotiate the prices of high-cost prescription drugs. The Secretary of Health and Human Services will create a drug price negotiation program that, in 2026, will negotiate the cost of 10 high-cost prescription drugs, increasing to 20 drugs in 2029 and beyond. Drugs subject to negotiation will be selected from among the 50 drugs with the highest Medicare spending in both Part D, B, and Part D, drugs administered by physicians. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the drug pricing provisions of the IRA will reduce federal deficit by $237 billion over 10 years and benefit 65 million beneficiaries. Additionally, these provisions might also directly impact states by reducing the amount of state Part D clawback payments to Medicare to the extent that these payments are based on a state's per capita Medicaid expenditures for Part D prescription drugs for dual eligibles. If these expenditures come down as a result of the drug pricing measures, state payments may also come down. The rebate provisions require drug manufacturers to pay a rebate to the federal government if the prices they charge for single-source drugs and biologicals rise faster than the rate of inflation. Rebates will be paid into the Medicare Supplementary Medical Insurance Trust Fund to help offset the costs of this program. This provision went into effect on October 1st for Medicare Part D drugs and will be in effect in January for Part B drugs. The rebate requirements are expected to have significant impact on Medicare drug costs. For context, the Kaiser Family Foundation in 2019 found that half of all Medicare drugs exceeded the rate of inflation. The last note on rebates is that, unlike Medicare, Medicaid currently does not have a rebate program in place. So the IRA extends the enhanced subsidies for people buying health insurance on the Affordable Care Act marketplaces. These credits make the health insurance marketplace more affordable for a record 14.5 million enrollees in 2022 and would have expired at the end of this year. Had the credits been allowed to expire, it was estimated that 13 million subsidized enrollees would have now been subjected to increasing out-of-pocket premiums, putting private insurance out of reach. The IRA extends these credits through 2025. This extension not only makes health care affordable for millions, but also gives states additional time to prepare for the eventual termination of the credits. Additionally, the timing of the extension has added benefit of providing states with some cushion when the public health emergency ends, likely in the next few months. The end of the public health emergency will terminate the Medicaid continuous eligibility requirement that has been in place during the public health emergency. People who find themselves disenrolled from Medicaid as a result may instead now be able to find low or no cost coverage in the marketplace while subsidies are in place. Which brings me to my last comment about the enhanced subsidies, which is that these are temporary extensions. And when they expire in 3 years, marketplace enrollees who have been eligible for the subsidies may be facing steep premium increases. On vaccines. Beginning in 2023, the Inflation Reduction Act requires that adult vaccines covered under Medicare Part D that are recommended by the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices be covered at no cost. This is currently the case with Part B vaccines. State Medicaid and CHIP programs will also be required to cover all ACIP-recommended adult vaccines without cost sharing. Kaiser Family Foundation estimates that approximately 4 million adults could gain coverage of at least one or more vaccines as a result of these new provisions. Bear with me, we are in the home stretch of these healthcare provisions. Medicare does not currently cap the out-of-pocket drug costs until a beneficiary hits the catastrophic threshold, which, at the moment, translates into a roughly $3,000 in out-of-pocket costs for brand name drugs. And even then, most are still required to pay 5% of their total drug costs above the threshold until the end of the year. There is no limit on total out-of-pocket costs. The IRA changes this by capping out-of-pocket costs at $3,250 in 2024 and lowering that to $2,000 in 2025 and beyond, indexed to increases in Part D. So Just a few quick contextual statistics that will give you a sense of this impact. 1.4 million Part D enrollees incurred annual out-of-pocket costs for their medications above $2,000 in 2020. Based on the average out-of-pocket spending, these 1.4 million Part D enrollees would have saved $1,355, or 40% of their annual out-of-pocket costs. Part D enrollees with higher than average out-of-pocket costs will save substantial amounts with $2,000 out-of-pocket spending cap. For example, the top 10% of beneficiaries are about 150,000 people with average out-of-pocket costs for their medication above $2,000 in 2020, who would have spent at least $5,550, would have saved $3,567, or 64% in out-of-pocket costs with that $2,000 cap. Although the IRA's healthcare provisions target federal programs, the law does provide some interesting opportunities for states. I will wrap my healthcare comments with just a few general comments that the IRA sets the stage for states to leverage the federal provisions in a variety of ways. First, capping drug prices in state markets. Second, creating state penalties for drug manufacturers who raise prices faster than inflation. And now that the IRA has capped out-of-pocket insulin costs for Medicare beneficiaries, states may consider moving forward with legislation to create parity for non-Medicare consumers who need insulin, a step I understand Maryland took with the help of the leadership of this committee during the most recent legislative session when you passed SB 353, the Insulin Cost Reduction Act, capping insulin costs at $30 a day for a 30-day supply for beneficiaries on state-regulated commercial health plans beginning in January. Now, I'd like to change gears and give a short overview of the energy and environmental provisions of the IRA. So to start, the IRA provides $370 billion aimed at clean energy production, electric vehicles, greenhouse gas reduction measures, which is the largest component of the bill. But to be clear, this is not $370 billion in direct federal spending. Of the $370 billion, $270 billion is estimated to be delivered through tax incentives, with the remainder being a combination of direct spending and funding for federal energy loan programs. On the spending side, I should note the bill's establishment of the $27 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to help finance investment in clean energy technologies. Additionally, there's about $20 billion in direct spending for USDA to spend on farming practices to reduce emissions from agricultural production. Two final items I will touch on are how the bill strongly encourages additional energy productions on federal lands, both fossil and renewables, by requiring the Department of Interior to auction off existing federal water and lands, in addition to opening up new offshore waters for energy development that had been previously taken out of production. Simultaneously, the IRA also creates a new fee on methane emissions for oil and gas producers. So to start, the aim of these tax credits, or incentives or carrots, is to drive a shift toward cleaner energy production, be it renewable or fossil energy with carbon capture and sequestration that will eventually lead to substantial reductions in overall greenhouse gas emissions. These include some obvious tax credits for wind and solar production, but also carbon capture and sequestration, hydrogen, nuclear, biofuels, and a new credit for sustainable aviation fuel. Of course, you have probably the widely reported tax credit for electric vehicles, and a number of new tax credits for consumers to purchase energy efficiency home appliances, which I'll touch on in a minute. Now, prior to the IRA, Congress had generally only approved these types of tax credits for wind and solar on an annual basis through what was commonly known as the Tax Extenders Bill. Instead, the IRA extends both the investment and production tax credit for renewable energy production for 10 years. For fossil energy, the bill extends carbon capture and sequestration tax credit while also increasing that tax credit to as high as $85 per metric ton of carbon capture from the current level of $50, so a substantial increase. Nuclear energy would receive a 10-year production tax credit for nuclear energy producers, and this would be in addition to the $6 billion nuclear energy program passed by Congress as part of the infrastructure bill last year. The bill also creates a new credit for the production of clean hydrogen, in addition to the billions in hydrogen-related research also included in the infrastructure law. On the fuel side, the IRA creates a tax credit for the domestic production of clean fuels that would be based on their carbon emissions, while also continuing tax credits for biodiesel and, of course, as I mentioned, the creation of a new tax credit for sustainable aviation fuels. The other aspect of this bill, as it relates to the energy and environment, is the funding the bill provides for the U.S. Department of Energy to recapitalize the agency's loan programs. These programs are generally designed to take an amount of capital and use it to loan out significantly higher amounts. Specifically, the first area I'll mention are loans for energy infrastructure. The IRA provides $5 billion, which is estimated to support up to $250 billion in loan or refinancing guarantees. These loans would be focused on projects that retool, repower, repurpose, or replace energy infrastructure no longer operating, as well as enable existing energy infrastructure to avoid, reduce, utilize, or sequester air pollutants and greenhouse gases, which the bill defines as carbon dioxide, hydrofluorocarbons, methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. Separately, the bill provides $2 billion for direct loans to non-federal borrowers to construct or modify electric transmission facilities deemed necessary to the national interest, and that deeming would come from the U.S. Secretary of Energy. Additionally, DOE would receive $5.8 billion to provide financial assistance for domestic, non-federal, non-power industrial or manufacturing facilities engaged in energy-intensive industrial processes to purchase, install, retrofit, or upgrade advanced industrial technology to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Finally, the bill provides the Department of Energy with $3 billion for loans for the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Incentive Program to support facilities in the U.S. producing low or zero GHG emissions vehicles, as well as $2 billion for grants for domestic production of efficient hybrid, plug-in electric hybrid, or plug-in electric drive and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. The energy provisions of the IRA extend beyond tax credits and incentives for industry and are important to note given Maryland's location and the opportunity for wind, solar, and other renewable energy infrastructure. Specifically, the Department of Interior would only be able to issue new onshore wind and solar rights-of-way on federal land if the agency had held an onshore oil and gas lease sale in the prior 4 months. For offshore wind, that requirement would be an auction of offshore oil and gas leases the previous year. Additionally, the bill reinstates the 2021 Gulf of Mexico oil and gas lease sale, which previously had been overturned by a federal court, and requires additional lease sales in the Gulf. Additionally, the IRA lifted the September 2020 offshore wind leasing moratorium off the coast of the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, and issued a requirement for the Department of the Interior to ensure that the lease auctions for new renewable power projects on federal land and water were contingent on future oil and gas auctions. Additionally, the IRA would provide $100 million in funding for offshore wind electricity transmission planning. This includes research into using non-transmission alternatives, energy storage, and grid-enhancing technologies for community economic development. Now, back to the tax credits. But at this time, let's focus on the consumer-facing tax credits. So we'll start with the widely noted new tax credit system for the purchase of electric vehicles, $7,500 for a new vehicle, and $4,000 for used vehicles beginning in 2023 and lasting through 2032. Unlike the previous EV tax credit system, which limited each manufacturer to only 200,000 eligible vehicles, the new program does not set a cap on the number of vehicles, but rather on the income of the buyer, the cost of the vehicles, and the vehicle's components. It is designed to help promote the domestic production of the vehicles and their batteries. Tax credits would only be available for vehicles that cost less than $55,000 for new cars and $80,000 for pickups and SUVs. Additionally, credits would only apply to buyers with an income level of $150,000 for a single filer and $300,000 for joint filers for new vehicles, $75,000 for single filers, and $150,000 for joint filers for used vehicles. Should these requirements be met, half of the tax credit would apply if the vehicles were built with minerals extracted or processed in a country the United States has a free trade agreement with, while the other half of the tax credit would apply if the vehicle contained a battery that includes a percentage of components that were manufactured or assembled in North America. The critical minerals content of an EV battery must be 40% by the end of next year and 80% after 2026. A battery must be 50% assembled in North America by the end of next year and reach 100% assembly by the end of 2028. Should a vehicle and buyer comply with these conditions, a buyer would be able to receive discounts at the point of sale that are equal to the value of their credits for the first time. Additionally, though the bill does not expressly outline any waivers, these requirements are defined and applied by the Treasury Department, and the IRS could provide some leeway for vehicles to comply that do not currently. On the home energy front, overall, the Inflation Reduction Act provides significant incentives for low and moderate income households to electrify their homes, as well as replace fossil fuel furnaces, boilers, water heater, and stoves with high-efficiency electric devices. The first program, the High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Program, would provide over $4 billion for fiscal 2022 grants to states to implement a high-efficiency electric home rebate program. It would provide an additional $225 million for tribes to implement a similar program. State energy programs would then provide rebates for qualified electrification projects such as electric heating and cooling or high-efficiency electric stoves. The IRA provides a rebate of up to $8,000 for installed heat pumps that can both heat and cool homes, a rebate of up to $1,750 for a heat pump water heater. Homeowners can also obtain up to $840 to offset the cost of a heat pump, clothes dryer, or an electric stove, such as a high-efficiency induction range. If a home would require an electrical upgrade to install any of the above items, an owner would receive up to $4,000 in rebates. Owners would be limited to $14,000 in total rebates, though an owner's income could not be greater than 150% of the median area income. The second program I want to talk about focuses on overall home energy savings. The Homeowner Managing Energy Savings, or HOMES program, would provide a similar $4.3 billion for fiscal 2022 for state energy offices, according to the State Energy Program formula effective January 1st, 2022. State energy offices would be required to submit plans to implement the program, including producers to calculate energy usage and savings. States cannot use more than 20% of grant funds for planning, administration, or technical assistance. Rebates are available for homeowners and aggregators for energy savings, retrofits on single-family homes, and, importantly, multifamily buildings. For homeowners with incomes that do not qualify, the IRA provides a general tax credit of up to $2,000. Relatedly, residential solar panel installation would receive a 30% tax credit through December 31st to 2032, declining to 26% for solar panels put into service after that date, but before January of 2034. Homeowners who install solar battery systems with at least 3 kilowatt hours of capacity would also qualify for this tax credit. Now, I'm going to spend a few more minutes discussing some of the direct spending included in the bill. To start, the United States Department of Agriculture would receive roughly $20 billion for programs would provide financial and technical assistance to private landowners to implement voluntary conservation programs on private lands. The funding within the IRA is split across USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service and includes the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, the Conservation Steward Program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and lastly, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. Now, let's look at more than $40 billion provided to the Environmental Protection Agency. However, I want to caution members that these programs are competitive and not formulaic like we saw with the Infrastructure Act, and that the parameters of these programs, to my knowledge, are still under discussion. To start, more than half of that $40 billion would come through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which would receive $27 billion, allowing the agency to invest in clean energy technologies via green banking and offering federal financing for projects. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund would invest in nonprofits, states, and local financing institutions designed to rapidly deploy low and zero emission technologies by leveraging investment from the private sector. States, municipalities, and tribal governments are required to receive at least $7 billion of that 27, though they are also eligible for the remaining $20 billion. I'll also note the bill provides $5 billion for state planning and implementation of greenhouse gas reduction programs. It provides an additional $3 billion for EPA to establish a program to award grants and rebates for the purchase and installation of zero-emission equipment and technology at ports, as well as the development of climate action plans at ports. It provides $1 billion to establish a new program, the Clean Heavy-Duty Vehicles Program, to award grants and rebates to states, local governments, and nonprofit school transportation associations to replace heavy-duty vehicles such as garbage trucks and school buses with zero-emission vehicles. Finally, the bill provides $1.5 billion in financial incentives for industry subject to the methane reduction program to better monitor methane emissions and to help address legacy pollution from the oil and gas sector. So to wrap up our IRA review, one thing to be looking ahead at is the possibility that Congress will enact permitting reform legislation. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there was a tentative agreement between Senate Democrats to take up separate legislation in the lame duck period that would enact significant changes aimed at both speeding up and improving the federal and state infrastructure permitting processes. Though still unofficial, the legislation is expected to require federal permitting decisions under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, to be made in under 2 years, while states would still have 1 year to complete the Section 401 process as it applies to any project activity which may result in a discharge into waters of the United States. The President could designate high-priority infrastructure projects that receive priority decision-making, as well as provide new authority for the Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to site interstate electric transmission facilities. And while a final permitting plan has yet to be released, Senate Republicans have also released their own version, the Simplify Timelines and Assure Regulatory Transparency Act. Personally, I expect some type of agreement between members of the Senate, with the House likely to go along if Democrats lose control in the upcoming midterms. If they retain control, an agreement between the two chambers is much less likely. Finally, I'd like to close with some potential next steps for you all to consider. Obviously, the IRA provides significant federal funds to increase domestic energy productions of all types, and though most of this is done through tax credits and loans to private industry, there are still billions of dollars for states to apply for, of course. NCSL is happy to connect you and your staff with the relevant federal agencies and congressional offices and committees. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben. And again, just to reiterate, the healthcare analyst couldn't make it today, so I know you're the energy guy, so I appreciate you incorporating her slide deck into your presentation. So that said, we're going to go through the rest of the panel, which is definitely energy focused entirely. We're going to start with Mary Knoll from the Maryland Public Service Commission.
Good afternoon, Vice Chair Feldman, Chair Kelly, members of the committee. My name is Molly Knoll. I'm a senior policy advisor with the Maryland Public Service Commission. I'm going to just grab control of my slides. So as we just heard, the Inflation Reduction Act has comprehensive and huge impacts on the clean energy space. But I want to make sure it's very clear at the beginning that while this legislation will have huge impacts on the clean energy space, the Maryland PSC does not regulate the generation of electricity. And so many of the things in the IRA are going to be adjacent to what the PSC does in kind of a day-to-day work. So the variety of things that we just heard about will absolutely move the clean energy space forward, and that will impact what the PSC does, but it's not something the PSC is directly in control of. So we're going to talk about 4 areas and how they relate to the PSC. We're going to talk about renewables and clean energy, energy storage, energy efficiency, and electrification, because those are the ones that are most relevant to existing programs that the PSC oversees. So renewables and clean energy, you just heard very comprehensively that there are a number of actions that the IRA takes that are going to move forward for nuclear, for offshore wind, for solar. In Maryland, and what the PSC does, what that means is that those technologies are going to be adopted faster. We're going to have a much cleaner emissions profile in the PJM market in the near future. For the PSC, if we have new generation that's being built, we may see an increase in CPCN, or Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity applications. The PSC's authority and oversight is for siting of that generation, but we do not approve the generation, we do not require it to be built, our utilities don't own it. So we may see increase in CPCNs. It would change the economics on offshore wind. But currently, there is no additional space available in the offshore wind statute. The PSC has heard the rounds that are available and awarded all of the credits that we have in terms of the ratepayer impact that the legislation allowed. We have also been working on making sure that our grid is ready to accept all of this clean energy. We've recently updated the interconnection standards for our utilities. And we've also had a number of studies that the utilities are undergoing looking at what electrification is going to do to their systems. Energy storage, again, there's a number of actions that the IRA is taking to encourage deployment of energy storage, both at the grid level and in the customers' homes. What that means for Maryland and for the PSC is for the Southern Maryland Electric Cooperative and maybe Choptank as well, there's going to be specific incentives for rural electric cooperatives. So we may see more applications of storage in those territories. Maryland does already have a storage pilot. The storage that's been selected for those pilots has already occurred. The utilities are already in the implementation stage. Where we'll see an impact from the IRA is if the utilities do seek funding under this statute, it'll change the amount that ratepayers ultimately have to pay for those storage installations. The second thing that we'll see is we already have utilities that are deploying storage in Maryland. They already exist in some of our distribution systems. And again, ratepayers won't have to pay as much for those storage installations. I do want to flag on the bottom left of this slide that there is an open question right now as to whether or not utilities are allowed to own storage and then use that storage in the PJM markets. When you have storage that's just kind of right on the bubble of economic, if you're able to arbitrage the energy, buy energy when it's less expensive, discharge it when it's more expensive, and get another revenue stream, it can tip the number into the cost-effective range where the utilities will start pursuing storage more. Because the energy storage pilot was done in legislation, there was obviously authority to do that, but it hasn't been answered whether or not the PSC can approve the utilities using storage in the market since they're not allowed to own generation. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but that is a space where the economics of storage are still in play. But the IRA will change that as well in a way that may not make it necessary to answer that question immediately. In the energy efficiency space, as you heard, I'm sorry, was there a question?
We're going to have, when you're done, there is actually, even though I said at the outset, we're going to wait until everybody, we have a couple of folks who are itching to ask a question to you, so why don't you finish, and then we're going to go to the two questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in the energy efficiency programs, there are going to be programs related to building energy efficient codes, the homes program. Maryland does have a very robust energy efficiency program in the Empower program. The commission did actually propose in a report over the summer that the legislature examined looking at switching from an energy efficiency program to a greenhouse gas reductions program. If these rebates go out, many of them are low income targeted, the commission does have jurisdiction over the Department of Housing and Community Development's Empower programs, which serve low income customers. But again, to be very clear, the PSC's jurisdiction is limited to the use of ratepayer funds. So if DHCD elects to seek funds either via MEA or directly from DOE, the Public Service Commission would not have authority over those funds. The Commission often urges DHCD to leverage those funds, seek them out, and use them to reduce ratepayer costs. But again, we wouldn't have direct oversight of those funds. The other thing that will happen as we have more energy efficiency and electrification is that we will have increased usage on the electrical system. So that takes us to the electrification. Again, this is just a list. We heard more comprehensively from NCSL about what these are and what they will do. This is the biggest space where the IRA is going to have an impact on the Maryland grid and the Maryland PSC. Just recently, BG&E came out with a study done by E3, building on studies that organization had done for the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. If we reach our 2045 goals, BG&E is projecting an increase in demand at peak, which would require them to build an excessive number of new substations in areas where they do not have land to do that. So the biggest thing that the PSC is going to be working with in the next several years, decade, is making sure that our utilities are able to serve the new load in the most efficient manner possible and without having to make significant increases in the infrastructure of the system. If we have to double the size of the grid, we're going to double the cost of electricity, even if we have lower cost clean energy that's flowing through it. So the key is going to be making sure that everybody is aware and planning properly for the changes that we expect this to have on the distribution grid. That's going to be the biggest priority for the Public Service Commission. And this legislature did pass a law last year, requires us to look into distribution system planning and report from this year and going forward. And the commission also has a number of activities that they're engaged in. We have an electrification study that we're putting out in the near future. We have our own distribution system planning process that we're looking at. We've transitioned to multi-year rate plans, which gives us sooner and greater insight into the utility planning processes and spending decisions. So this is definitely something the PSC has been focused on and will continue to focus on. So again, just to wrap up, the IRA is going to have a huge impact in the clean energy generation space, and it's going to have kind of peripheral impacts on what the PSC does every day, but in ways that we are aware of and will be monitoring. And the question is really just going to be, how quickly do these things start to impact the grid? And then how do we manage those impacts as they happen? And I'm available for questions.
Okay, well, thank you. Lisa, you're just here for questions? You're not separately?
That's correct.
Okay.
I'm here for questions if needed. Thank you,
Gotcha.
Commissioner.
Okay, so that said, Chair Kelly and then Senator Kramer did have some questions for you, Ms. Knoll. So why don't
Yeah,
we-
I just have one. With our PSC having a more limited scope of authority with regard to energy regulation than other states, how does the PSC look at its mission? Does it need refurbishing or more comparable authority or whatnot?
So in light of being a restructured state, we don't have authority over generation. So unless we undid restructuring, which is a huge question, there's very little we can do at the PSC to encourage clean energy generation. We can do things like changes to the renewable portfolio standards, increases to SRECs, increases to the available ORECs. So while we cannot direct our utilities to build generation, for example, because our utilities can't own generation, this legislature and the Maryland Public Service Commission can do, much like the IRA is, we can move the needle on the economics. I think the phrase that my colleague used was encouraging behaviors and incentivizing investments. And the PSC can do that with authority from the legislature without direct control over the generation that is built. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Madam Chair, may I add, in terms of refurbishing, one issue that has come up, and I know some of the Budget Committee members are here, so I'll take this opportunity if you don't mind. There have been many new mandates. Molly just mentioned many of them that the legislature and its very, intelligently asked us to do and get a jump on in Maryland. But we have the same staffing levels that we had 20 years ago. I think it's at least 16 positions we've put in fiscal notes just in the past couple of years that we didn't get any of. So definitely, and I'm sure that other agencies feel similarly, we're going to have to think about how the state staffs up and puts the resources in place to realign our agencies and meet this moment and, take advantage of all these funds that we're speaking about. And I know you've been supportive in the past, so I just wanted to mention.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Senator Kramer, you had a question for Ms. Knoll?
I do, thank you, Mr. Chair, and just a couple of, and I apologize, didn't mean to ask out of turn, but I figured while it was happening, I'd ask you about it. You made some comments about this is going to change our offshore wind development in some form or fashion beyond what we already have in place, and I didn't quite follow what that was about. Can you give me a little bit of an explanation as to what that is and whether we need to make changes?
Sure. So I will stay high level because offshore wind is Ms. Best's space, and she apologizes. She has sick children and was not able to be here today.
Okay.
So the legislature enacted both a round 1 and a round 2 offshore wind. And what the PSC does is we receive project proposals, we look at the economics of the project, and we assign offshore wind renewable energy credits. So what the PSC is doing is handing out an economic incentive for the project. And in round 2, we actually saw a production tax credit, much like they have in the IRA, which ended up doubling the amount of offshore wind we were able to approve with the existing offshore credits that we had
Now, that was
available.
federal?
That was federal, yeah. There was a
Okay.
federal production tax credit. And so
Right.
we ended up with twice as much wind deployed as what we otherwise would have received with the same ratepayer impact.
Got it.
But in approving those, the PSC has now approved the full amount of ORECs that are available right now. So if the legislature wants more offshore wind renewable energy credits from ratepayers in Maryland, we will need additional statutory authority.
So are you saying to take further advantage of federal incentives, we need to take a look at our statute at the moment and those limitations? Am I?
So, yes, but
Sure.
I'm going to clarify just the littlest bit.
Okay.
If you want to provide more incentives in Maryland, more ratepayer dollars to have more offshore wind deployed, yes.
Got it.
However, the commission was very clear in their orders that they expect any additional credits that come available to be pursued by the existing developers. So if these are available, we expect our projects that we've already approved to become less expensive going forward. Just
Got it.
because these folks are getting ORECs doesn't mean they can just go, oh, there's nice federal money, but we're not interested. They still need to pursue that.
Would that bring down the cost to ratepayers if they pursue?
It would, but we won't know how much until the offshore wind is deployed and we start seeing the projects flowing electricity, which could be several years. And so in the interim, we don't have any money to award anything.
Do we jeopardize losing federal benefits if we delay? Because I get you, we do have to wait till the electricity's flowing, but as you said, that's several years away. Are we at risk of losing federal benefits to the offshore wind program during that period of time?
We can get back to you on that one. I hesitate to say yes or no because it's kind of a more complicated picture than that. I
Sure.
expect that some of these federal benefits will flow to the existing approved project. And I just don't know if the industry wants to be providing more and that's the only barrier or if there's more at play. So we'll get back to you.
Gotcha. Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And one other question, if I may, Mr. Chair, with the issue of storage, and I guess it was, early 2000s when we, did our thing with the generation and transmission. I know Senator Feldman would remember that period of time. What was it?
You're talking about 99 restructuring.
99.
Yeah, that did
That was-
predate me, just.
Okay.
Okay.
You,
Yeah, Melanie was there.
oh, there you go. All right. You look like you would have. That's
Man, come on, man. Just ask the question.
the good Senator Griffith does not look like she could have possibly been around at that period
Witnesses
of time.
over there.
So that was an act of the legislature, and if there is some question with regard to where storage falls into this division that we have, that could be a simple act of the legislature to clarify that, correct? And
Yes.
we could do that if it were timely in the upcoming session. At what point in time do you think we need to act as a body?
I think that's an excellent question probably for the utilities on kind of when this becomes an economic issue for them. This could also be resolved as a matter of statutory interpretation at the commission. And the commission was actually going to resolve it in the energy storage pilot proposal, but the legislation passed in the interim. We didn't need to make that decision at the commission. So it may or may not require legislation, but it's certainly ready whenever this body, has an answer that they want, to put out
So we
there.
have to determine whether that clarification is needed, and then it can be done either administratively through the PSC or legislatively and just make the distinction clear as to
Correct.
where it falls. Gotcha.
Yeah, and the question of whether or not storage is generation is
Right.
there are a lot of people that go both ways on it. It's not unique to Maryland.
But it's just a matter of clarification then, and that
Correct.
could easily be done
Yes.
as to where we want to put that.
Correct, yes.
Okay, will the PSC make a recommendation as to where they think that should go?
Without a live case in front of the commission, I wouldn't expect them to do that.
I think, Senator, from what I've been hearing lately, and this could change, and we'll keep, of course, the committee members updated, but so far, with where this pilot is right now, our plan is to report out as mandated to you. As of, we weren't planning to ask for anything in this moment, like Molly said. It's not an urgent issue that we think needs solving today, but we will be reporting out all of our findings and the economics of the project, including the impact of the IRA on the pilot that you all assigned us with in a couple years.
Okay, good, great, thank you.
Okay, since we've crossed the Q&A Rubicon, Senator Hershey, and then Senator Augustine, let's just get it out
All
there
right.
now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Molly, you were mentioned that the 2045 goals would put us in an increase of demand at peak times.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so does that mean that the current grid could not handle that? Or we did ask you to do a analysis of the grid based on the legislation. And have there been findings yet as a result of that?
So the distribution system planning work group is still in process, and we will be reporting December 23rd. But if, for example, we doubled the demand at peak tomorrow, no, the grid can't handle that.
Right. And is that, what type of, in the 2045 goals, what type of, was that a doubling of it, or was that?
It was a doubling at peak,
At peak.
approximately,
Okay, so we know clearly that the grid cannot handle something like that, correct?
as currently structured.
It's currently structured. Is anybody providing an estimate of what the carbonizing of the grid would cost? Do we know anything like that yet?
So the BG&E E3 study, which was just for BG&E service territory, was projecting between, I believe it was 38 and 53 billion. B, with a B,
38 to 50 billion dollars,
correct,
just in one of the service areas, just in
in one
BGE.
service territory.
Okay. And do they, I mean, obviously BGE, if they did the work, obviously that would be passed on to ratepayers
Correct.
to accommodate that? Through, how would that be done? Through a rate change, a rate case, or just would there be a specific tariff, or could it be done in a number of different ways?
It could be done in a number of different ways, and it's not, I just want to be clear, it's not a foregone conclusion. I mean,
Right.
if the electricity is, I'm going to try not to get too into the weeds, but electricity is used in a load curve, right? There's less produced and consumed at 3 a.m. than is produced and consumed at 3 p.m. And so that doubling at peak, if we can shift that and have that consumed in the valleys through the deployment of storage and electric vehicles and heat pumps and smart home management, and through, quite frankly, all of the things that are in the IRA, we can avoid that or mitigate that or manage that. And so the study that BG&E put out is simply a snapshot of, if we had to do this exactly as we currently are with exactly the technologies we currently have, this is what it would look like. And that cost is really going to depend on how quickly we adopt EVs and how quickly we adopt clean energy and how quickly we get solar panels and storage. And so those numbers, I think, are going to be good for a couple of years, but I think that picture is going to change constantly as we go forward.
All right, but there's a lot of changing consumer behavior in your statement right there, right?
Yes.
An awful
Yes.
lot, okay. Just, again, the price tag being one thing, but the time to do these type of upgrades, how long does something like that take? I mean, obviously, we'd have to make that decision up front to be ready for 2045 goals, but I'm assuming even in going to those goals, we'd be starting to reach peak capacity as well, too.
I mean, the question of how quickly we reach peak capacity is a question of how quickly we electrify homes, how quickly we electrify transportation, and then that's tempered against how quickly we deploy DERs in the system. So if we deploy DERs at the same speed that we have customers electrifying their transportation, we may have little to no impact on the grid if they're co-located properly and those things happen apace. It's an incredibly complicated balancing act. I've heard people say that the grid is the most complex machine humans have ever built, and decarbonizing it is probably going to be the most complex undertaking humanity ever does. And so it's a lot of moving parts all of which are either going to have to move in tandem to stay together, or they're going to end up out of balance, and that's where things are going to get pricey. And the commission sits at the middle of all of that, keeping an eye on what the utilities do, making sure they have the capital they need to deploy the infrastructure they need to make sure that the lights stay on, but also making sure that we don't put an inordinate pressure on ratepayers.
Right. At the end of the day, it's their plan, right? It's the utilities plan that would end up having to be reviewed and approved by you.
Yes.
Okay.
And Senator, just to repeat, in addition to add on to the studies, the electrification study that we're working on is due per the Climate Solutions Now by September 2023. Obviously, we're working on an extremely tight timeline and relying on data from a lot of other stakeholders. So our staff originally had a much broader scope, and they've been asked to tailor down that RFP by a lot of different stakeholders. So, but things like cost, some of these factors, transmission constraints, other things, our team believes we need to continue to study. So I don't think that electrification study work group is going to go away. Right. I think this study is part one. We want to be part of continuing to study all of these variables and answer all of these questions.
I agree, and much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, Senator Augustine.
Thank you. There are two things. One, I wanted to circle back to the CPCN siting issue and whether or not is there any impact or change given what the gentleman from NCSL was talking about on some of the licensing requirements? And then what is going on with that? Because, I mean, we've heard about the issues with the CPCN in here over and over and over again.
So I think if there's, I think if there's changes to the federal licensing requirements, that simply feeds into what we require at our CPCN process. When we handle a CPCN, we look at whether or not the generation is going to be able to comply with what PPRP and MDE and kind of all the kind of limitations are. So we're looking at wetlands impacts, we're looking at traffic impacts, we're looking at kind of what it means to have this generation in this location, but we're not looking at whether or not this generation is economic. That happens at the PJM market level. And does that answer the question?
Well, and I'll also speak, I think maybe, Senator, you were asking about the process more generally, about getting the renewables deployed. Because obviously, the CPCN process is just one part of that, right? So, and I know the Distribution System Planning Work Group is starting to pull some interesting data on this about the pace of renewable development in Maryland. So the legislature may want to look at, what we think some of the factors are. We're obviously not deploying solar as quickly, and maybe MEA can speak to this. I don't want to steal their thunder. This is definitely their wheelhouse. But there may be you could definitely look at the SRECs, and increasing the incentives at the state level would be one thing. Right now, we don't have a backlog with our CPCN process per se.
Okay.
There's other issues with PJMQ. I think I've heard from the developers. We talk to them all the time. The local issues have been big.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then on just going back, trying to get my arms around this cost of of electrification and I heard it loud and clear, but just trying to understand what is happening federally perhaps could impact the $38 billion to $53 billion that you're talking about, that the way that this looks like it's going to end up could potentially get paid by ratepayers.
So the majority of what's in the IRA is not going to impact that 38 to 50 billion because that's infrastructure spending for the utilities. Now, there are impacts from the IIJA on that spending. But when you think about an energy bill, it's probably, let's just make the math easy, 50% moving the electrons and 50% consuming the electrons. And so while that 38 billion is going to make it more expensive to move the electrons, hopefully clean energy is going to cost less because your costs are in building, but not then in fuels. And so the expectation is that with all of these incentives and with a broader deployment, the consumption or production cost of electricity could go down. So you may be spending more to move the electrons, but you may be spending less to produce the electrons, if that makes sense.
Okay. That does make sense. And just one real last, this is in and around it, but it's a little bit different. I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are on this. While we're doing this and we're pulling out, this is totally a separate area, but like gas taxes and the way that we are able to maintain our roads and everything else, is that a part of this discussion at all, or do we have to deal with that entirely separately from this discussion?
So the Public Service Commission will pass through any taxes that the legislature directs on usage on the electricity bill. Right now, there are no transportation taxes on the electricity bill or anything like that. So right now, that is not something the PSC works on or kind of does anything with.
I think there are county level taxes
There are-
that we pass through.
Yeah, there are environmental surcharges, there are county level taxes, there are state level taxes. Anything the legislature directs the utilities to collect, we will allow the utilities to collect, we'll put it on the bill, and it'll, flow through to all the appropriate folks, and we will check that it flows through to the appropriate folks. But the commission is not going to, without direct authority, enter into that space.
Okay, so you're saying it's a mechanism that is there, but right now, we're not utilizing it necessarily, other than in some small
Correct.
instances. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, Mr. Chair, I appreciate it.
The tax policy, I want to acknowledge we've been joined by the chair of the Budget and Tax Committee, Senator Gazzoni. Welcome. Next up, we've got the Public Service Commission. We've got Dr. Mary Beth Tung, the Director, and Landon Farrig, Assistant Division Director of Policy. Are you both going to testify, or are you going to?
I'll be
Dr. Tung?
testifying, and Mr. Farrig will
That'll be
be
her cue.
answering questions
Gotcha.
if need
Okay,
be.
we've got your slide deck, so it's all yours.
Awesome. I didn't think you got it. That's great. For the record, I'm Mary Beth Tung, the Director of the Maryland Energy Administration. As you note, Mr. Vice Chair, we are joined by Landon Farrig, our Legislative Liaison and Assistant Director of Policy. We also are joined by Jen Galicchio behind us, who is the Assistant Director of our Programs team, and also by Wyatt Shiflett, who is our Finance Director. I want to thank Madam Chair and Mr. Vice Chair for having us here today to talk about this important topic. And our interest in these new federal programs, as you can imagine, is as strong as yours are. And rolling out these programs is going to take quite a lot of effort on the part of everyone to make sure it's done right. And it's important for you, it's important for us, it's really important for our constituents to make sure we get this right. I want to thank the previous presenters for the contribution. They took some of my stuff that I was going to talk about away and presented in a way that was probably much better than I could have done it, so I thank you. I hope to add some detail to what has been highlighted, shed some light on how these programs will be integrated into current operations and how they will affect MEA directly. The Federal Inflation Reduction Act, as you heard, signed on August 18th, contains a number of energy-related provisions, which you've already heard. One is the Homes Residential Energy Rebate Program and the High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Program. These are two totally different programs, and I want to delve into some details on those now. These two rebates will assist qualified applicants for certain home energy efficiency upgrades. The U.S. Department of Energy will be providing an allocation of funds for these programs to each state on a formulaic basis, as was discussed earlier, through DOE's existing state energy program or SEP framework, and MEA is the receiving agency for SEP funds. The SEP funds will ultimately flow from DOE to MEA. MEA will then be responsible for designing and implementing the IRA-funded home energy rebate programs in parallel with MEA and the state's existing portfolio of energy programs. We've gone to several meetings over the last several weeks, and we found out that Maryland is way ahead on this because we actually do have programs that already do a lot of this, and the federal programs can be rolled out in conjunction with those. We acknowledge that the interest in these rebate programs is significant. I'm sure your offices are getting lots of phone calls, and so are we. So we have fielded questions regarding implementation, timeline, program administration for individuals, legislators, all of you, and the private sector alike. But we have to urge patience as we get those calls and emails, as the program development process is progressing, but it's currently residing with DOE, and they're not giving us too much of any information on that yet. I suspect they're still working on a lot of these very complex issues. We've proactively tried to address these concerns. We've established a dedicated page within our website to communicate the information available so far, which isn't a lot, but there is some, related to the new federal programs of IRA as well as the IIJA. If you or any of your staff are fielding these questions as well, which I'm sure you are, we would invite you to use that advice from the MEA website. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. We're cutting and pasting from the website a lot, and our answers as well, because we're updating as much as we can the information that we do have. So our website, social media posts should reflect any new information once it becomes available. If you don't have access to our social media pages, let us know. We'll make sure that you have that access. We also tend to send out emails to our distribution list, and I'm pretty sure most of you, if not all of you, are on that. We also provided feedback on the high level of interest in these new residential programs directly to DOE staff at a recent CEP conference, and we've also been talking with them directly through the National Association of State Energy Officers. And also, as Senator Feldman is aware, the Southern States Energy Board has been also involved in this, and Maryland's a member, and Senator Feldman attended, and as did Senator Hershey, the recent meeting in September. So we're trying to go at this from different directions and make sure the DOE is aware of our concerns. Other state energy offices in other states indicated similar levels of interest. We are hopeful that this on-the-ground insight helps bring guidance forth on these two programs more quickly. And of course, this is more about IRA, but the IIJA or the BIL, however you want to call it, is intricately intertwined in many respects. Funding for these IRA programs is not yet available, as I said. And DOE has not provided any timing on when these funds may become available. We get tantalizing hints, but we haven't heard anything yet. DOE has also not finalized state-by-state funding levels yet, but we do have some guesses on that, and I'll talk about that in a second. The first milestone in the program development process will occur when DOE issues guidance to state energy offices like MEA. This will outline the requirements of the new rebate programs, allowing MEA to develop implementation plans compliant with the federal requirements. MEA will then submit an application to DOE to access the new federal funds. Once MEA's application is approved by DOE, and I'm pretty sure and hoping it will be, the funds must be appropriated through the budget process or budget amendment through this body. Only then can we begin establishing and operating the new programs to the benefit of eligible Maryland residents. At this point in time, DOE has offered no specifics on how the IRA energy programs will be structured. MEA does not have visibility into what the eligibility criteria ultimately will be, other than what was in the bill itself. And trust me, NASIO, SSCB, and some of the others are working very hard on trying to get that insight, but we don't have it yet. Therefore, MEA is advising that any project completed prior to DOE, and this is when we get phone calls from developers and whatnot, any project completed prior to DOE issuing program guidance would run a risk of potentially being ineligible for the IRA funding if those projects are done or being relied on prior to the FOA going out from the federal government. I and the staff at MEA are extremely excited about these programs and the opportunity to implement them at the state level once we get the information. As mentioned earlier, DOE has not provided any state-level budgets yet. However, allocation of funds to the state is expected to utilize a CEP formula. Therefore, we can estimate the homes energy efficiency rebates and the income qualified electrification rebate programs will have a Maryland-only combined budget of over $140 million for rebate programs administration through 2031. These are expected, and this is one of our concerns and the concerns of other states, these are expected to be very high-volume programs. It costs as much to put $1 million program through as it does something for $1,000. So this is a concern that's very high volume. MEA anticipates this program could involve more than 50,000 individual rebates over the life of the program. Some are estimating 66,000. And so we usually handle about 7,000 a year, and that's on our high year. So you can see the level of grants that will be handled through our offices. For comparison, as I said, the rebate programs in fiscal year 22, which is a banner year for us, was only was 7,700 awards, which I was ready to say only. That was a lot. And that really, it was a challenge to get those through. So we're talking about if we take this number, 50,000 to 66,000 over a number of years to 2031, we could easily double our workload in a single year. The Homeowner Managing Energy Savings Rebate Program, or HOMES program, has a total nationwide funding from DOE of $4.3 million, which I think was discussed earlier. Awards are likely to typically be less than $10,000 per household, $2,000, $4,000, up to $40,000 per multifamily building. So this is why I said they're going to be small but very high volume loans compared to what we're normally give out. Rebates double in size for low and moderate income households and buildings, and rebates vary in size depending on the relative modeled energy efficiency savings. So there's a lot of complications in addition to income verification, which we currently don't do for our programs. High efficiency electric home rebate program, there's $4.275 billion for fiscal year 2022 available through 2031 for DOE to award grants to state energy offices at a high-efficiency electric home rebate program to provide homeowners and owners of multifamily buildings with rebates for qualifying electrification projects. Unlike the HOMES program, the electrification program is income restricted and will only be available to low and moderate income households or the owners of multifamily buildings that are primarily occupied by low and moderate income households. The term low or moderate income household means an individual or family total annual income, I believe this is covered earlier, of less than 150% of the median income of the area in which the individual or family resides, as reported by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Low income means an annual household income of less than 80% of the area median income. Program benefits are capped at $840 to $8,000 per appliance, depending on the appliance, $14,000 per project, and up to 100% of total upgrade cost for low income versus 50% for moderate income households. Eligible upgrades include electric water heaters, electric heat pumps for space heating and cooling, electric stoves, ranges or ovens, electric clothes dryers, circuit breakers, insulation, air sealing, and materials to improve ventilation, and electric wiring. Last but not least, there will be a state-based home energy efficiency contract training program, a total of $200 million nationwide until 2031 for grants to states to develop and implement energy efficiency workforce training programs. These would provide training and education to contractors involved in the installation of home energy efficiency and electrification improvements, including improvements eligible for rebates under a HOMES rebate program. States may use the fund to reduce the cost of training contractor employees, provide testing certification of contractors trained and educated under a state program developed and implemented pursuant to subsection A, and partner with nonprofit organizations to develop and implement a state program pursuant to subsection A. We're especially excited about this program, as it would be a great sibling program to MEA's Maryland Offshore Wind Workforce Training Grant Program that supports workforce training centers entering the offshore wind industry by offsetting their capital operating expenditures. So it will be exciting to do a second workforce program. As for MEA's own efforts and responsibilities, MEA's proactive approach has already begun, starting with IIJA administration, so we sort of got started practicing there. These efforts will be combined with the changes needed to effectively execute the provisions of the IRA. MEA is leveraging its existing partnership with the Maryland Environmental Services, or MES, to procure the support needed to plan for and help administer these programs. The support is mostly in the form of technical assistance, technology, including software solutions to track the progress of federal programs, people to synthesize that information and disseminate it appropriately, and additional resources to help develop program applications, assist in monitoring awards, and assuring compliance with federal requirements. The IRA provisions must similarly be addressed and could potentially be administered through a partnership outside agency. And looking forward, MEA is actually anticipating additional support for rebate processing is likely to be needed due to the very high volumes, as I discussed, of applications that are anticipated. Incentive levels were changed by technology, modeled energy savings for the project, and household income level. This means that income verification, as I said before, will be needed for some of the federal benefits. The good news is we see synergy with current MEA and other state energy programming. As I said, a lot of states don't have that, so we're ahead of the game on that. Integration of these new federal programs is key to ensuring that the new programs augment state efforts rather than duplicate or supplant the good work we're already doing. This means that the MEA's existing LMI, the Low and Moderate Income Energy Efficiency Program, which builds synergy and with nonprofits and local governments by supporting energy efficiency projects that benefit low to moderate income Marylanders. Grants are awarded for energy efficiency projects that generate significant reductions in energy use and the savings that are passed on to LMI residents. IRA implementation will also require collaborative efforts, as was mentioned earlier, with DHCD and the Weatherization Assistance Program. Lastly, MEA envisions significant engagement with stakeholders in the Public Service Commission and power planning process. And we are on the distribution planning work group, so we've been involved in that for quite some time. MEA knowledge base and infrastructure as it relates to working with outside entities such as nonprofits that engage with low to moderate income EJ and other disadvantaged communities can be leveraged. There's no need to reinvent the wheel at MEA. We have the experience, know-how, and relationships to deploy these programs and funds, although at a bigger level. However, depending on the guidance received from DOE, substantial industry and stakeholder engagement will be needed regarding methods and monitoring to ensure consistency and fairness. To this end, MEA has been developing a diversity, equity, and inclusion team since June of 2021, so they will be actively involved in this process. The team went live in January of this year, and we have shifted our focus when engaging with the Strategic Energy Investment Advisory Board to include engaging on EJ and limited income issues. With that, I will turn it back to you, Madam Chair and Mr. Vice Chair. Again, MEA welcomes any questions that you or any of the members have.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tung. Any questions for any member of the panel here on any topic on energy? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony today. That was very, very thorough. We're going to now transition from energy policy to healthcare, health insurance. And I'm going to bring up Michelle Eberly, Executive Director of the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange, and Joanna Fabian, Director of Policy and Plan Management at the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange. So, Michelle, I'll let you take it from here.
Very good. Thank you very much, and good to see you all on this fine Tuesday. So we'll talk about the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on our activities, but I also can give you an update if you're interested on our preparedness for open enrollment, which starts in about 2 weeks. Would you like me to do that?
Yeah, that's good stuff. Yeah.
I'll start with that?
Yeah.
All right, very good. Well, we are well prepared. This is our 10th open enrollment period, so it's hard to believe it's been 10 years since we first started this. And everything is set. We've got all our notices out. Consumers can come right now and start doing some pre-shopping. We've got new features for this year. So we
Michelle, could you just pull the mic over because we're streaming this out?
We redid our mobile application, so we're pretty excited about that because we've streamlined it. We've put biometric authentication in it. We've included enhanced artificial intelligence and optical character recognition solutions for data entry and data validation, and we have a much more simple and modern design to get in and to use that app. We're finding that about 65% of consumers that come through are using a mobile application, which is really good, particularly since we know young people like that mobile application, and we like to get those young people enrolled. We also implemented this year, it's called Broker Connect. And it's a feature that allows a consumer to request an insurance broker reach out to them within 30 minutes. And so they'll request that. We send that out. We give a list of 3 brokers that have 15 minutes to respond to that consumer, and it gets them connected within that 30-minute time frame for really near real-time assistance, which is great. And our brokers love it because it's a free lead, a free business lead to the broker community. Our marketing efforts this year is we continue to look at how can we reach all populations, and especially into segmented populations. We'll be airing some ads during the World Cup. That's a big event for our Hispanic community, so we're really focused on that. And we've this year put in 12 different gyms. When you're on your treadmill exercising, you're going to probably see our ad come up to remind you to get health insurance. So we're pretty excited about all that. Last year, we topped 180,000 enrollments. We are looking forward to having a better enrollment. Of course, it's always an unknown. This year, we have more people that are employed, so they may have more employer-sponsored coverage. We have the public health emergency that will not end until January, the third week in January, so that also will keep people on some health insurance. But the good thing is with the reinsurance program that has continued to impact the rates and keep the rates lower, even though there was an increase in rates, the young adult subsidy, which has helped. And then finally, I'll transition into the Inflation Reduction Act, because the continuation of those subsidies will really help us keep people insured this year. So doing that transition into the Inflation Reduction Act, we just are so grateful to all the people that we worked with. This was a big effort for state-based marketplaces across the nation. We really worked on getting information out to our federal delegation of how important this was. We had anticipated that without the continuation, we would probably lose about 45,000 enrollees because they could not afford their health coverage. So we gathered up user stories. We went to our consumers, to our navigators. We got stories. We shared them at a national level. All of the state-based marketplaces came together and sent letters. Senator Cardin and Senator Van Hollen were just tremendous advocates for us, and we are just thrilled to pieces at this finish, across the finish line. We were not hopeful at some periods of time, but I'll let Johanna go through the specific details of how the impact is for our consumers. But again, really want to reiterate what a national effort this was to get these expanded tax credits continued. There's more work to be done. We have a short runway of a couple more years, 3 more years before we'll have to really be looking at a permanent solution. And then one other thing you'll be hearing about is the reinsurance program and the impact on that. And again, I'll just bring that to the attention of the committee that we really need to look at a long-term solution on that funding. We have the 1% assessment that was passed, thanks in part to your committee last year, but we know that that's likely not going to be sufficient, so we'll need to keep a real close eye at that. And we are working with the MIA, who's putting together the work group to assess a longer-term solution. So with that, I thank you, and I'll turn it over to Johanna.
Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on Maryland Health Connection enrollees and on the reinsurance program. We can move on to the next slide. Oh, sorry. Oh, there we go. Got it.
Just the arrows.
Got it. Thank you. All right. So first off, we'll talk, sorry, our slides got a little wonky here, but we'll talk about the impact on Maryland Health Connection enrollees. So as was discussed in the first presentation, the Inflation Reduction Act extends increased federal premium subsidies through the end of 2025. Those had been slated to end at the end of this year, so they were in place for 2021 and 2022 because of the American Rescue Plan. This adds another 3 years to those subsidies. You can see in the chart on the right how those subsidies work out. This is a little technical, but basically the federal subsidies are calculated to ensure that no one pays more than a specified % of their annual household income for a benchmark silver plan on the exchange. So without the American Rescue Plan and now the Inflation Reduction Act, in 2023, people would have been paying the percentages shown on the left, so ranging from about 3% up to about 9% of their income for a benchmark silver plan, depending on their federal poverty level. With the Inflation Reduction Act, those numbers are reduced to between 0 and 8.5%. So at the lowest end, those people just above the Medicaid threshold, they actually now qualify to pay nothing, or depending on some technicalities, they may have to pay a few dollars per month, but that's really big savings for people who are just, churning perhaps in and out of Medicaid with their income just over that 138% threshold. At the top end, for people over 400% of the federal poverty level, without the Inflation Reduction Act, those people are ineligible for any assistance. With the Inflation Reduction Act, there is now in place a cap for everyone of 8.5% of their income towards premiums. So if premiums exceed that amount for the benchmark plan, they're now eligible for assistance, which in particular helps our more middle income and older enrollees. To put some concrete numbers on this, in 2022, we have about almost 140,000 individuals enrolled through Maryland Health Connection who are receiving federal premium subsidies. Their average premium with those enhanced federal dollars is $100 per person per month. Without those enhanced dollars, that would have been $182 per person per month. So that's an $82 or 45% savings on average. So you can see that really is quite significant. And if we had lost it, that's why we would have been concerned about the enrollment declines that Michelle mentioned. Just a couple of testimonials from consumers gathered by our navigators in Montgomery County here. The first one, a navigator reports how she worked with a consumer whose premium was lowered from $200 to $150, and said the consumer was beyond grateful and was planning to use those savings to help pay for her medication. Another navigator reported the story below that says they were helping a consumer who, prior to the enhanced subsidies, was enrolled in a bronze plan, and with the additional premium assistance was able to upgrade to a silver plan. So she got better coverage, lower deductible, lower co-pays, and her premium actually fell. So just a few tangible stories. And then in terms of how this is impacting not just premiums and anecdotally enrollees, but our actual enrollment growth, you can see that the premium assistance from the American Rescue Plan and continued by the Inflation Reduction Act has really helped to fuel record growth in the exchange. For 2022, we gained 47,000 new enrollees. We had record increases in our communities of color, with an 11% increase in Black enrollees and a 14% increase in Hispanic enrollees. And we also saw a 7% increase in young adult enrollees. And of course, we had not just the increased federal dollars supporting young adult enrollees, but also increased state dollars through the state premium assistance program. The next portion of my presentation is on the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on our state reinsurance program. So just a few kind of recap slides on how successful this program really has been. As you guys know, it's substantially reduced premiums. They're down more than 25% compared to the year before the reinsurance program started in 2018. And our plans are about 20 to 30% below national averages. We have some of the lowest cost plans available on exchange in our state and the nation. As Michelle mentioned, we hit record enrollment of over 180,000 as of the end of this most recent open enrollment, and looking forward to seeing how that number develops in our upcoming new open enrollment. When we look at the individual market as a whole, and of course the reinsurance program supports people who enroll both on and off exchange, we see that enrollment is up about 5% year over year between 2021 and 2022 to a total of about 233,000 individuals. That's both on and off exchange. As Michelle mentioned, as I'm sure you all are aware, the state reinsurance funding 1% assessment that provides the state portion of funds to support the reinsurance program was extended through 2028. It had been slated to sunset in 2023. That extension is great because it provides us a baseline of funding that we can point to in our upcoming application to the federal government to renew the waiver and extend it for another 5 years through 2028. It also established, as Michelle mentioned, a work group led by the MIA in consultation with the exchange to look at the appropriateness of that fee and overall reinsurance program impact and funding sources, as well as some other items, with a report due in December of next year. So just to get into a little bit of how the Inflation Reduction Act in particular is impacting the reinsurance program, it does, we're very happy that it passed for the sake of the reinsurance program in addition to the impact on our enrollees, because it is going to lead to increased federal funding for the program. That's because the federal funding for the reinsurance program is based on the amount of savings the federal government experiences as a result of that program in a scenario where we have the program and it reduces premiums, which then reduces the amount the federal government spends on premium assistance, compared to a scenario without the program where premiums are higher and the feds are spending more on premium assistance. So the difference between those two scenarios is the amount of funding we get. Because the Inflation Reduction Act yields more federal premium assistance, it essentially leads to a higher delta in those with and without reinsurance program scenarios. And for 2023, we anticipate that that will increase our federal funding by about $124 million compared to what we would have gotten if the IRA hadn't passed. So that's really certainly a significant additional addition to our federal funding. However, I will note that even with that additional federal funding as a result of the IRA, we do anticipate that starting this year, our annual federal funding plus the state funding we collect through the 1% assessment will be less than the total cost of the program. We have reserves that we've built up in past years, so we're going to start spending those down to fully fund the program. And we, at this point, anticipate that we will continue doing that in future years. This is a graph here that shows in the blue line the funding projections for where we would have been without the Inflation Reduction Act, and in the orange line where we anticipate being with the Inflation Reduction Act. And I will caveat to say that these projections are a bit outdated, so they don't truly reflect what we're anticipating. We're in the process of working with the MIA and our consulting actuaries to update them. But the graph serves to indicate that the Inflation Reduction Act, every year that it's in place does increase our anticipated federal funding, which is great. And overall, as I mentioned, we're working to update these projections, and then we'll be discussing them with MIA and the work group assembled by MIA as we consider the future of the program and funding appropriate to support it. And I think that's it for my presentation.
Okay, well, that was good. We take a lot of pride here in the committee on that reinsurance program. It came out of this committee, and it's done. It's been very successful. So that said, any questions of either of our two witnesses? Okay, seeing none, thank you both. We're going to go to the cleanup batter, if you will. Andrew York, our Executive Director of the Maryland Prescription Drug Affordability Board, first in the nation. Andy, welcome. We've got your presentation here, so the floor is yours.
All right. You guys can hear me through the mic? Yep.
Yep.
Thank you, Vice Chair Feldman, Chairman Kelly, and members of the committee. It is an honor to be here before you today. As you know, we are an independent agency charged with making prescription drugs more affordable for Marylanders. So we're excited to provide an update on the Inflation Reduction Act. I will be focusing mainly on the drug pricing provisions of the Act. There are two that were mentioned by our NCSL colleague. One was the expansion of the low-income cost subsidy for Part D. I'm not going to address that, but that is a major innovation. Then also the coverage of vaccines, the full coverage of vaccines. I won't address that, but it is a important affordability provision. So I will go through this very briefly, but I'm happy to do a deep dive if you have any questions. The main things we'll talk through is the inflation penalty, Part D reform, Medicare Part D as in dog, and then also the Medicare prescription drug negotiation. I am lucky to be following our NCSL colleague that provided a very deep dive on the healthcare provisions, so I'll try to summarize and focus what's going to be most relevant for the state of Maryland. So I'll go, you don't need an overview of the provision itself, but moving to slide 4, again, we're talking through the inflation penalty, which I'll do a quick dive on. In Part D reform, there's 3 components that we'd like to focus on. One is a copay cap for insulin. There's also an out-of-pocket cost maximum. And then finally, there is the removal of a 5% coinsurance in the catastrophic phase. And then finally, the thing that gets probably some of the most publicity is the Medicare price negotiation. I'm going to go chronologically as all of these are implemented. So all of them come in on different timelines. That's primarily because Part D plans are independent plans that need to account for some of these plan design issues when they put their bids together. So that's how this timeline worked out. The first one is the inflation penalty, and that starts on January 23rd. And the general idea here is that if drug prices, the list price of a drug, goes up beyond faster than the CPIU, just general inflation, they owe rebates back to Medicare for the difference of what that inflation is. This is projected to save $56 billion over 10 years, though one thing to flag is that it's going to be about $71 billion in savings to Medicare, but it could cost Medicaid $15 billion. The reason that is because Medicaid already has an inflation penalty as part of their rebate program, and this is theoretically going to change the behaviors of manufacturers, so they won't get the same savings that they would have already expected. The baseline is starting in 2021. And this should affect the overall market because Medicare makes up about 30% of the overall drug spend in the country. So theoretically, if you have to do a rebate for Medicare, it's enough of a threat that it should drive the overall market. So that's the general idea behind the inflation penalty. Do we want to open for questions after each policy, or should I just go through? Sounds good. Yeah. So here's some details on how it would work, but I'm just going to, I think I gave the overview. Hopefully you have a general idea of the idea behind the inflation penalty. Then we go into the actual Medicare plan design itself. And as you may know, Medicare is for patients, Marylanders that are 65 and above, and then a few patients with certain chronic diseases. But there was kind of a quirk on how it was developed. It was created in 2005 and didn't account for the fact that drugs got very, very expensive between 2005 and now. So a few things that were problematic is the donut hole, which they've resolved over time. Another issue is that it has no out-of-pocket cost maximum, and this has been devastating to older Marylanders. So the first thing that we'll flag that goes into effect first on January 2023 is a $35 copay cap for insulin. And again, that kind of fits. The reason they had to do it was because of, again, how the donut hole works and things like that, but it basically sets a copay cap for insulin. As you all know, we have a $30 copay cap in Maryland, so as always, we are leading the way on healthcare policy. But this very much aligns with that, and it is good that our Marylanders on Medicare have that same benefit for insulin. The next provision that goes into effect is the removal of the 5% coinsurance. So when I mentioned that there is no out-of-pocket cost, basically there's something called the catastrophic coverage. And when you get to that point, the patient is paying a coinsurance, which is based on the total cost of the drug. So you go all the way through, and then you pay 5% of whatever the drug costs. And there is no limit to that. So some patients on certain rare diseases can have, we've heard stories from patients that have, had to clear out their life savings due to, costs up to tens and tens of thousands of dollars a year. So the first thing they're doing is getting rid of that coinsurance in the catastrophic phase. And I think that caps it at maybe $3,250 as an overall out-of-pocket cost. And then in 2025, they actually are setting a hard $2,000 limit as a maximum out-of-pocket cost, which is going to be very helpful for those patients that do kind of go into that catastrophic phase. And what you see is generally a long tail, right? Most patients are taking standard medications that are, in the $30 to $100 range, and then you have these patients that are taking extremely expensive medications. And this is basically protecting those patients kind of at the long end of that tail. This is a diagram, and you can see how complicated this plan design is. I'm happy to walk you through it, but I think I'll just skim through it. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to actually describe the changes over time. And again, it's kind of like a historical and budgetary accident that the plan design was built this way, as you may know from some of your exercises. And then the last thing I'll end with is the Medicare negotiation for prescription drugs. So again, when the Medicare Modernization Act, sorry, we're on slide 11. When that was created in 2005, they put in something called the non-interference clause, which basically meant that Medicare is a price taker. And this effectively resolves that issue and allows Medicare to negotiate for certain drugs. Again, Medicare makes up about a third of the market, so you can think that they are generally market movers. And it's going to be eased in over time, and it sets basically what is I want to make sure I get the term right, a maximum fair price, and then they're also allowed to negotiate beyond that. So there's kind of like a legislative formula that sets a maximum fair price, but then they can also negotiate additional discounts beyond that. This is going to be rolled out over time. First is going to be the Medicare Part D program. D as in dog, and that's like your drugs that are filled at the pharmacy. That starts in 2026, would be the first time that a negotiated price takes place. And then Part B as in boy are physician-administered drugs. You can think of oncology infusions in the hospital. Those take place in 2027. There's a number of different restrictions, so it targets a specific type of drug. Basically, drugs that have been on the market for a long time with no competition are generally the drugs that start, and I think they ease it in, starting maybe with 10 drugs to start with, and then 20 drugs yearly after that. I want to make sure I got those numbers right. That might not be exactly correct, but basically it eases in starting in 2025, 2026, and then will continue to increase over time. There's a new agency, agency within CMS that's charged with doing this work. And I guess the thing that I'll end with is the relationship to state work. So I'm on the last slide, slide 14. And one of the things that was so challenging for our work as the Prescription Drug Affordability Board is that we are primarily regulating, again, things at the state level. And that basically left Medicare off the table for us. But many of the folks that are having a lot of prescription drug affordability challenges in Maryland are older Marylanders on Medicare. So I can just say it was very helpful and hopeful to see this kind of change happening at the Medicare level. It allows us to partner our work and build our work at the state level on what some of the federal work is doing. And I think in a number of ways, it allows us to continue to lead the way. We very much think that the Inflation Reduction Act complements our work at the Prescription Drug Affordability Board. We have the authority to do something called setting upper payment limits, which I think is generally comparable to the Medicare negotiation that's happening. But we're also taking a much broader view, trying to implement as many policies as we can to make prescription drugs more affordable. So I think there's a lot of space to continue to do action at the state level and potentially lead the way and show the way for our federal colleagues. So with that, I will open it up to any questions. Happy to do a deep dive. There's a lot of technical details on a lot of these policies.
We'll open up for questions. I do want to ask you, I think the board owes a report. Where are we on the report with recommendations back ahead of next session to this committee, or can you give us an update on that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the report itself, we're hoping to publish in our next board meeting, which is in November. So the fourth November, I think November 26th, I want to say, 28th, which is the fourth Monday of the month, and it's at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're planning to publish that report, and that basically has 4 parts to it. One is an overview of just Maryland drug spend overall. The second portion is a description of the drug market itself. So one of the issues in the prescription drug market is how complex the supply chain is, so just letting you know who the players are, where the incentives are. And then there's a portion on what are the drivers of prescription drug affordability. Again, I think it's just a number of weird incentives that have been developed over time. So, how do we actually address those issues? And then the end is a basically buffet of policies that Maryland and other states are already doing and are considering to make prescription drugs more affordable. They did vote on their initial list of recommendations, and these are the things that hopefully have the shortest runway. One is developing a transparency program. So the issue that we have in the prescription drug market is something called kind of the gross to net bubble, that no one actually knows how much a drug costs. We see how much is paid at the pharmacy counter, but then there's kind of backroom deals that no one has insights to. So you have no idea how much a drug actually costs. You can't go to anyone and understand what the actual cost of a drug is. So we're trying to get to the heart of that issue. The second one is an insulin affordability program that basically complements the copay cap that Maryland has done and also now the federal government. Maryland covers, obviously, the insurers that are regulated in the Maryland market, but it leaves a group of uninsured and underinsured folks that may need access to insulin. So we're basically trying to create a program that captures that last group of patients that may not be able to afford their insulin. And then the last one is to move forward with something called our Upper Payment Limit Action Plan. So if we were to move forward with setting an upper payment limits, the first thing we do is develop an action plan that describes, 1, how do we select the drugs, 2, how do you set the upper payment limit amount, and then 3, how do you actually implement that? What does that mean to the supply chain? Where does that transaction actually happen? And that would be presented to the Legislative Policy Committee for approval, and then if it is approved, then it would go back to us to implement, likely through regulation.
Okay, well, that was helpful. Thank you. Any questions, any member? Mr. York? Madam Chair, anything from you?
No, I just want to thank everybody for being here. This is really important work to get us started. I want to recognize Chairman Gazone, President Pro Tem Griffith, and Delegate Brooks, who will soon be Senator Brooks from District 10. Senator Augustine.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say what an honor it's been to serve with you and learn from you, and I'm just so really grateful for all that you've done. So thank you so much for your service.
You guys have been a joy.
We've got Senator Klausmeyer wants to weigh in.
I want to reiterate what Senator Augustine just said, and from us to you, Madam Chair.
Oh, my God.
We're not going to let you go without it.
And then on that high note, we can officially deem this briefing adjourned, and we can take pictures and all.